Okay, welcome back, folks. This is another contextualized reading. This time it will be Richard II, Act 3. I've been unpacking throughout my course this summer, and especially in the Richard II contextualized readings, notions of Euro-Christianity. So referred to earlier contextualized readings, I'm just going to continue with that language here, but my argument has that I've been developing is that reading Shakespeare's Richard II especially allows us to see expressions of what I will call a Euro-Christian worldview, different from ideology. And this is a sociological designation. It has nothing to do with exactly religious belief, but Euro-Christianity saturates the text so much that in order to understand the cultural poetics, in Stephen Greenblatt's terms, of the play, we need to understand some things about at least Euro-Christian theology. And I have said that I think that Shakespeare is writing a political theology. He's not just writing histories or tragedies. He doesn't have those kinds of genre distinctions that we might have in the 21st century. He's blending them all together for a civic and purpose that can't be divorced from religion. And this is a different way of reading, I think, than the way he has traditionally been used and celebrated, definitely in broader popular culture as just sort of being a kind of humanistic universal. I'm reacting against humanistic readings of the play of Shakespeare in general, and as a way to sort of teach students, especially how criticism has developed and continues to develop around Shakespeare, which is outside of the sort of let's celebrate Shakespeare for the sake of Shakespeare, which I think is tied to a traditional Euro-Christian civilizing mission that perpetuates ongoing colonialism, which we tend to think of as in the past. But again, I've said, if we only look to indigenous worldviews, we see that Native Americans, for example, are constantly still subjected to Euro-Christian colonialism. And I don't think that Shakespeare himself, the author, has anything to do with the way that he has been used. I don't think that he really, he wouldn't really know so much, although he would definitely have a sense of Christianity as being, superior to Islam in his own times, and he would have, embraced that language of seeing infidels or savages to a certain extent. We'll see that a little bit of that going on in The Tempest. His own work, he doesn't seem to have been interested in publishing his own work during his own lifetime. So the way he's been used as a civilizing force to get people, especially in colonies, to value English cultural products, that's not necessarily part of Shakespeare's own agenda, but that's definitely the way he's been used. And when he's uncritically put into curriculum, I think that is definitely part of the ongoing Euro-Christian supremacy. This is probably a little bit outside of like a straight English program. I think if you're doing an English literature degree, it's kind of hard to avoid Shakespeare, but the ways that English programs have been constructed over time are intimately tied to Euro-Christian colonial history, which is worth unpacking on its own. So let's go to Act 3 of Richard II here, and to come back in, and we'll see. I'll keep drawing on and emphasizing what I think is necessary, why I think it's necessary to think in terms of Euro-Christianity as a social movement here. And so Bolingbroke returns in Act 3 here, and he captures and executes Bushy and Green, who are Richard II's allies. In their conflict with each other, he references that he is going to wash your, by which he means Bushy and Green, to wash your blood from my hands. And of course, in any kind of Christian inflected society, those words are going to recall Pontius Pilate in the Bible, right? So Shakespeare here is depicting Bolingbroke as Christ's murderer. And that's what the kind of cultural poetics of Euro-Christianity do, just in a simple line like that, is they work to figure characters as types of others, or type, anti-type reading. So Bolingbroke becomes a kind of Pontius Pilate, which makes Richard, and we see this very much throughout the later half of the play, into a kind of Christ figure. Now, we don't necessarily like Richard because he's not been a nice guy. And so if we go back to my earlier intro lecture, just to the play in general, Shakespeare's not necessarily dealing with heroes and anti-heroes, right? It's not that simple. But at the same time, I think a conventional humanist reading of the play would be that this is kind of signaling our shift towards later modernity and the secularization narrative and all of that. And I think that just as Emma Smith's lecture about Hamlet says we actually need to look at the way that Hamlet is looking backwards, I think that the same applies for Richard II here. We've got to look at the ways that nostalgia and nationalism are showing up for Shakespeare, the writer, who doesn't know the future, obviously, when he's writing this play. And I think that when we really start digging into the play as an expression of Euro-Christianity, we see how important Christianity is, or Christian theology is, to what Shakespeare is doing here. He is certainly not a secularist in this play. Bolingbroke blames Bushy and Green for causing a division between himself and Richard. He tells York to treat the Queen well, and that's kind of Act 3, Scene 1. In Scene 2, we see that Richard has returned to England, and we're going to see Richard here still kind of at the top of the wheel of fortune, and we're going to start seeing his descent. We've already started seeing Hereford, or Bolingbroke, Henry, move from Hereford to Lancaster, right? So he's kind of starting to come up, and we're seeing that there's going to be a fall and a rise in the imagery of Fortune's wheel. And Richard returns to England, and he says, "Needs must I like it well. I weep for joy to stand upon my kingdom once again." His exhortations here border on absurdity, and at times they're played this way, and when you look at depictions of stage performances of the play. But I think what Shakespeare is really getting at here is the depiction of the king's two bodies, as Kantorowicz has described. And I mean, Richard seems to notice it, right? So Richard says to the people around him, "Mock not my senseless conjuration, lords." The king is the land here, and the foliage, and the animals, and insects, all the way down to toads, right? As opposed to the king as a person who's just a person with a body, right? Those are the king's two bodies here. And Shakespeare, I think, is setting us up with Richard as he returns to the land, to the embrace of the land. And in fact, I almost think, I mean, it's also part of history, right? But I almost think that kind of return to Ireland, or that trip to Ireland, and the return is it further emphasizes like what's at stake in this play, which is land and colonizing efforts that Richard is going through as well. It could be in some ways a critique of colonialism. I would be willing to go that far. Whether or not Shakespeare is critiquing Elizabeth I for setting up colonies on Turtle Island, which is a competition with Spain, as I covered in my last contextualized reading. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know that he's commenting so much on foreign policy here, but I'll leave that open to consideration. Ironically, Carlyle here, who is, um, a religious figure, refers to the heavens, and we saw portents at the end of a previous act from the Welsh captain, at the end of Act 2, if you remember. And so we're getting these kind of cosmic commentaries, but whereas we had it from the Welsh captain, now we're having it from a religious authority. And so that's going to speak to a kind of tension in the place of the Catholic Church in this particular play. And we know, just look at what Henry does not do with Carlyle, even though Carlyle will get very upset later on in the play with what happens. Omerl here tries to interpret, but Richard seems confident in his divine placement here as he returns. So this is Richard talking. He says, "The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. For every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown, God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Then, if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the right." This is the divine right of kings. This is the capital K, king of the king's two bodies, right? Richard, again, is at the top of Fortune's wheel here, but we see him descending throughout Act 3 and from here on. And so Salisbury then comes in and announces Bolingbroke's return and departure of the Welsh. And Richard has lost 20,000 men immediately. So that's like right after Richard has this announcement that nobody can touch me. Richard starts, freaking out. And Omerl says to Richard, "Remember who you are." That's line 282 here. That's line 82 in scene 2. Richard says, "I had forgot myself. Am I not king?" And already we're seeing this questioning, right? Like the separation, like the idea of identity as opposed to the idea of something underlying identity, right? Something more divine. And then Scroop comes in here, and both the people and the nobility apparently seem to be opposed to Richard, and young and old as well. Richard here loses his temper. We get then Richard's famous speech, and what I think secularists miss about this is how an expression of Anglican theology has an emphasis on man's fallenness here. This is an extension of St. Augustine's or Augustinian original sin. And again, I want to put Augustine, even though he's Augustine of Hippo from North Africa, his theology is entering into Euro-Christian, this Euro-Christian construct that becomes so influential. So he's writing, of course, after Constantine. And around the same time, like after Constantine has embraced Christianity as the official Roman religion, right? So I don't think that binary divisions here just between Protestant and Catholic work so well. Especially, and again, that's why I want to emphasize the Euro-Christian not as a religious avowed faith, but as something that unites both Protestant and Catholics, despite their different theologies. The Anglican Church here has kept many ritualistic features of Catholicism, and this is why you have movements like the Puritans and why they call themselves the Puritans. And those Puritans would, of course, go and influence the political theology and what becomes the United States. And so I think that sometimes Americans and American students, because they're not always familiar with Anglican theology, they can miss some things. And then, of course, we have the secular humanist readings that kind of want to say, oh, we don't need to worry about religion or something like that. And it's like, no, actually, religion it's pretty important to understand, to understanding what's at stake in this particular play. As I've said, religion can't be divorced from nationalism or personal identity in these particular in Shakespeare's time and in his characters. So I've said Shakespeare's not a secularist. Even if we might look at his work and anticipate later trajectories towards more secularization. Emergent, I think, during the period here that we're talking about, probably a better term, are Protestant notions of what is called total depravity, an emphasis on humans as being totally depraved. And that's tied to that notion of original sin. And you can look up total depravity on, even like Wikipedia. It might be worth it looking up if you don't know what I'm talking about. And so look at these lines from Richard here. And he says the famous hollow crown. The hollow crown refers at least partially back to John of Gaunt's lecturing Richard in Act 2. So if I return really quick, this is John of Gaunt. 1,000 flatterers sit within thy crown, whose compass is no bigger than thy head, and yet encaged in so small a verge, the waste is no whit lesser than thy land. So look what Gaunt did. He took the crown, the inside of the crown, and then he mapped it back out onto the land. That's again the king's two bodies sort of working there. But he's introduced that kind of perimeter of the crown, and the crown gets lifted, right? The crown becomes hollow. It's no longer on the head, right? So Richard says this famously and beautifully, and I mean he's come back and I've mentioned this earlier, and other critics have mentioned it as well. It's just like Richard's language is given so much beauty and emphasis that I think that, like Shakespeare, we start to feel as an audience for Richard, even though he's been a total jerk in the earlier acts of the play, but we start seeing something else, and it comes with just the eloquence of his language that Shakespeare puts into his mouth. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king. I love that, like the mortal, like temples. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. And there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little seen, to monarchize, be feared, and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable. And humored thus, comes at the last with a little pen, bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king, cover your heads and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, for you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me that I am a king? It is not simply that he is losing his position at the top of fortune's wheel. It's that Richard is, in an imitation or an image of Christ, becoming fully human. He is mimicking Christ, and that's why I go back to Bolingbroke as Pilate. You need to understand that that's the Euro-Christian poetics at work when you're reading Richard II. And it's not simply that we're just moving away from a time of kings. That's not necessarily what I think Shakespeare is getting at here. What I think he's trying to display for us is this movement towards humility. And what I often think about is the Bernardo Bartolucci film, The Last Emperor, which does a similar thing. Even though the story is about China, I think that Bartolucci's Euro-Christian aesthetics are all over this beautiful story. And yes, of course, it's aligned with a kind of Marxist view, right? Or a leftist view. And I think that's really important to remember, that despite the fact that Marxists were against religion as a kind of ideology, Marx called it the opiate for the masses, for the masses, excuse me. Like, even Marxism is an expression of Euro-Christianity as a social movement, right? That's important. And I think that, like, if you just think about Bartolucci's film in relation to Richard II here, you might be able to see some of that. And there's a true beauty that we see. I mean, at least that's the telling of Bartolucci's The Last Emperor. Like, he ends up just being somebody on the street like anybody else. He ends up becoming part of the proletariat, right? And so maybe that's a little bit more celebrated, and maybe it's more tragic here. And Richard, I'll give you that for sure. But there's something about Richard that that is emphasizing total depravity and original sin, and that as humans we are hopeless without the Christian Savior. It's very much a Christian message. You don't have to believe it. I'm just saying that that's what the play is doing. So Carlyle then to Richard advises him to sort of man up. And this is so interesting that you're getting this kind of theological voice saying, oh, come on, man up. And it's like, actually, no. Because what Shakespeare is doing with Richard is making him into Christ. And here even the church doesn't recognize the image of Christ in Richard. So, fear and be slain, this nice quote. Fear and be slain, no worse can come to fight. And fight and die is death-destroying death, while fearing death pays death servile breath. And this is playing on lowercase death, and then death as a personification, and even death as kind of as a version of Satan showing up here as well. That sentiment, come back to it here. Let me say it again. Fear and be slain, no worse can come to fight. And fight and die is death destroying death, while fearing dying pays death servile breath. This is kind of almost like a Heideggerian existential angst that's tied to, I would say, heroic language and the heroic code. And we see this definitely in the last scene of Macbeth, when Macbeth sort of takes up arms. He's like, if I'm going to die, I'm going to go out fighting. We see this kind of image in TV shows and movies all of the time still. It's like, I'm going to go out with a bang. And that's what he's being advised to do, but Richard is not taking that advice. Instead, Richard is on his way down. And I think that tension is what it's a very compassionate thing that Shakespeare is doing with Richard as a character, to show that no, he is like Christ as a lamb on the way to the slaughter. So Richard does seem encouraged at this moment, but then we get a repeat of information from Scroop. And he tells Richard that York has joined Bolingbroke. And Richard basically essentially gives up here. So we move on to Act 3, Scene 3. We're back to Bolingbroke and his comrades here. And we see that York is admonishing Northumberland for not referring to Richard as king. And then he admonishes, he's kind of lecturing Bolingbroke too, that they're not respecting what the king, the king's, I mean, the king as sovereign, right? Both bodies of the king, but especially the king as sovereign. And Bolingbroke then instructs Northumberland to visit Richard, saying that he just wants his land back. And if not, I'll use but then he threatens him, right? He says, if not, I'll use the advantage of my power and lay the summer's dust with showers of blood rained from the wounds of slaughtered Englishmen. Which is a really interesting kind of twists upon his own precious Englishness, right? Remember all the way back to Act 1 and the proud Englishman that Bolingbroke is here. He's almost an enemy of the state, this kind of language. I mean, he is an enemy of the state at this point, but he's willing to sacrifice and slaughter English blood. Confrontation then comes with Richard, and there's a lot of light and dark imagery in here if you're following that and writing a paper, doing some close reading. Richard here questions Northumberland's lack of reverence. So Richard's questioning mimics York's questioning of Northumberland in terms of a lack of reverence. I think that's really important because it shows that Northumberland, at least the way that Shakespeare's depicting him, is that there might be a plan at work, that they might have already decided that Richard's going, even though that's not the way that Henry is presenting it at this point. And he says, if we be not king, and notice he uses the royal we there, show us the hand of God that dismissed us from our stewardship. For well we know that no hand of blood and bone can grip the sacred handle of our scepter unless he do profane, steal, and usurp. It's completely illegal to do this. It goes against all laws. It goes against even God's laws as they see it. Richard here is starting to sound, and he sounds many times like Hamlet. And we know that Stephen Greenblatt in Will in the World, which is a really good biography, makes this kind of case where that Hamlet is the expression of internalized thought on stage, and Hamlet's written about 6 or 7 years after Richard II here. But we do see, I think, a lot of Richard in Hamlet. Also, remember back to my Hamlet contextualized readings, and I said that many critics have read Hamlet as a kind of Christ and a kind of Christ figure. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I just want you to see that there are parallels, there are really useful ways to read Hamlet and Richard both as images of Christ in religious poetics, Euro-Christian religious poetics, and you'll get some different accentuations there, and you get the fact that I think Shakespeare as our writer is a deeply contemplative Euro-Christian thinker. He's thinking about the religious tensions and problems of his time. Is he able to satirize religion at different times and plays as well? Yes, I think that he is, and I think that we'll definitely see some of that in The Tempest. But The Tempest is written, not quite, but almost 20 years after this. And so there's quite a bit of development, I think, maybe in Shakespeare's own thinking between Richard and The Tempest, which we'll get to. That's what we're reading next, at least in my class here. So, so he sounds a lot like Hamlet here. Like even the first soliloquy, as he says, O God, that ere this tongue of mine that laid the sentence of dread banishment on yon proud man should take it off again. There are other places where he sounds this. I hear echoes, almost like Shakespeare kind of is looking backwards. You can just tell it's the same mind at work who's composed these speeches. Richard is also hypothetically deposing himself while Northumberland goes back and he's speaking to Bolingbroke. Richard is kind of thinking about deposing himself, and then Northumberland comes and physically asks him to come down. And so literally, again, I've said that he's coming down Fortune's wheel. Richard says, down, down I come, like glistering phaeton, which is a son of Apollo, right? In the story of Phaeton, which is told in Ovid, again, one of Shakespeare's favorite poets. Phaeton is half mortal, half immortal, and his dad, Apollo, says, I'll grant you anything that you wish. And he says, I want to take your chariot for the day. So Apollo's chariot is associated with the sun, or it chases the sun. And so it is the sun, but phaeton can't. It's figured as a horse with a chariot, right? So phaeton, as a mortal, can't hold the rings. And Aristotle, or sorry, not Aristotle, his father Apollo knows that he won't be able to do it, but he can't go back on his promise, and so he knows that his son is going to die. It's a really interesting story here. And so phaeton goes, and of course he can't handle the reins of the horses, and it scorches the whole earth with the sun, and the rest of the gods, and everything is, they're calling out that Apollo has to kill his son. Something that prefigures the sort of God sacrificing a son imagery that is of course part of the Christian worldview. So down I come like glistering phaeton, wanting the manage of unruly jades. And again, objectively, this is playing out Fortune's wheel. Richard then seems to be giving up, but he's also entering a Christ-like gesture. Richard says, cousin, I am too young to be your father, though you are old enough to be my heir. This is ironic because, of course, there is a legal heir in existence that's not very much referenced in this play, which would be the child Edmund, who is the rightful heir to the crown, and Bolingbroke has usurped his position. Because of that, it starts the Wars of the Roses throughout the 1400s. But Shakespeare's not giving that a lot of attention for probably various reasons here. But probably especially because of well, I mean, they're all kind of descendants of John of Gaunt to a certain extent. There's the War of the Roses is a break between Gaunt, or the House of Lancaster, and the House of York, but then it gets reunited under the Tudors for both sides. That's kind of what ends the Wars of the Roses. Act 3, Scene 4, we're back to the Queen and the gardeners, and remember from the earlier contextualized lecture that the Queen here is a complete fictitious character in Shakespeare's mind here. So what she does here, what we see from that is that we see Shakespeare's fictive element very much at work, and we can see from where she's placed in the story, I think, a lot of what Shakespeare's direct design is in relationship to his telling of history. So she's with her maids, and they're trying to entertain her and console her, but she can't because her husband's away. And then they hide and they listen to the gardeners. And this is, of course, echoes Hamlet. It echoes the clowns, right? The gravediggers in Hamlet. And then the Queen confronts them because she hears them talking about what's going on with Richard, and she says, "Thou old Adam's likeness." Now remember, the clowns in Hamlet are referring to the oldest, to their profession as gardeners, right? But also gardeners of human bodies, as being Adam-like in the Garden of Eden. And why should the nobility, instead of they're digging Ophelia's grave, right? Why should the nobility get to choose who gets to be in the churchyard and who is not? Well, the poor people who are closer to Adam are not able to have the same privilege. So fortunes both are weighed between Richard and Bolingbroke here, and we start seeing two images. I would say fortune, which I've said is Fortune's wheel, and justice, or Christian providence. We think about even pagan depictions of justice. What does she have? She has two scales in the balance, right? So I want you to think of that image, the two scales in the balance, and then Fortune's wheel. remember back to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Hamlet, who are living about Fortune's middle parts, and they don't want Claudius to be deposed because they stand to benefit from his staying in power, right? So justice is not necessarily always, it's about balance, but it's not necessarily good. It's about keeping certain people in power, which might make sense to some of you in the ways that justice can seem unjust. The gardener here is sympathetic to the queen's distress. He doesn't want to have distress her, and then of course, in a kind of homage to, I think, Ovid, he plants in remembrance for her tears at the end of Act 3. And that's going to take us to the end of this lecture video for now, as we head on to Act 4 and another one. This was a little bit shorter, and my earlier ones have been pretty long, so thanks for bearing with the long ones. This was a more compact one. We'll catch up with you again in another video. Hope you're having a great day or night. Thanks for listening and watching.